I woke up in the ICU with tubes down my throat and my daughter-in-law standing at the foot of my bed, holding a $90,000 hospital bill with her name on it. Jessica's face was white as the sterile sheets, and for the first time in 20 years, she wasn't smiling that fake smile she usually wore around me. Instead, she looked like she'd seen a ghost, which, considering I'd nearly become one thanks to her little experiment, wasn't far from the truth. Drop your city in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Let's dive into the story. You're probably wondering how I ended up here, fighting for my life because my own family thought I was a liar. Well, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. My name is Margaret Sullivan, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 58 years old, and I've been dealing with a severe shellfish allergy for over 30 years. Not the kind where you get a little rash or feel queasy, the kind that can kill you in minutes if you're not careful. The kind that makes your throat close up, your blood pressure drop, and your heart race like a thoroughbred at derby time. But here's the thing nobody talks about. Having an invisible disability in a family full of skeptics is like being on trial every single day of your life. It started in my late 20s, right after I had my son David. One minute I was enjoying a lovely shrimp cocktail at my sister's wedding, and the next minute I was on the floor of the reception hall, gasping for air while my husband carried me to the car. The emergency room doctor explained that sometimes allergies can develop suddenly, especially after pregnancy, when your immune system is all confused from the hormonal changes. "You'll need to carry an EpiPen everywhere," he'd said, scribbling notes on his clipboard. "And avoid all shellfish completely: shrimp, lobster, crab, scallops, even oysters. Cross-contamination can be just as dangerous." I nodded, scared but grateful to be alive. I thought my family would be supportive, understanding. I thought wrong. My mother-in-law was the first to question it. "Oh, how convenient," she'd say whenever I'd decline her famous crab cakes at family dinners. "Margaret suddenly can't eat shellfish right when it's my turn to host." She'd roll her eyes and make that little huffing sound she was famous for. Back in my day, people weren't allergic to everything under the sun. But the worst part was how my own son David started to doubt me as the years went on. At first, he was protective, making sure restaurants knew about my allergy and checking ingredient lists. But somewhere along the way, especially after he married Jessica, that concern turned into suspicion. "Mom, are you sure it's that serious?" he'd ask when I'd refuse to eat at seafood restaurants. "Maybe you've outgrown it. Mrs. Henderson from Jessica's book club said allergies can change over time, Mrs. Henderson from the book club. Let me tell you about Mrs. Henderson, a woman who thinks essential oils can cure cancer and that vaccines cause autism. But apparently, her medical advice was more credible than my 30 years of living with this condition. Jessica was even worse. She had this way of making little comments that sounded concerned, but were actually accusations wrapped in fake sweetness. "Oh, Maggie, you poor thing," she'd say in front of other family members. "It must be so hard to avoid things when you're not really sure what you're allergic to." Not really sure. I'd carry around an EpiPen, read every food label like it was the Bible, and call ahead to restaurants to make sure their kitchens were safe. But according to my daughter-in-law, I was just being dramatic. The doubt spread through the family like a cancer. My daughter-in-law's mother started making comments about convenient allergies at family gatherings. My own sister began questioning whether I was just using it as an excuse to be difficult. Even my 8-year-old grandson asked me once why I was scared of just little shrimpies. But I knew what I knew. I'd had 3 more reactions over the years, once from cross-contamination at a restaurant that used the same oil for shrimp and chicken, once from a salad that had been prepared on the same cutting board as crab cakes, and once from a kiss on the cheek from my neighbor who'd been eating lobster rolls. Each time, it was the same terrifying experience: throat closing, heart racing, vision blurring, fighting for each breath while someone frantically searched for my EpiPen. Each time, I survived. Each time, my family's doubt grew stronger instead of weaker. "She's getting worse," I heard Jessica whisper to David after my last reaction 2 years ago. "It's like she's more sensitive now, or maybe she's just more dramatic about it." More dramatic. As if nearly dying was a performance I put on for attention. But the real breaking point came 3 weeks ago at David's birthday dinner. Jessica had prepared this elaborate meal: prime rib, garlic potatoes, green beans, and a beautiful salad. Everything looked safe. Everything smelled normal. I'd even helped her prepare some of the dishes earlier in the day. I should have known something was wrong when she insisted I sit at the head of the table, right next to David. "You're the guest of honor's mother," she'd said with that smile that never reached her eyes. "You get the best seat in the house." The dinner was lovely. The conversation was pleasant. And for once, I felt like maybe the family tensions were finally easing. Maybe Jessica was finally accepting that my allergy was real. Maybe we could move forward and have the relationship I'd always hoped for. I was so naive. I'd finished my salad and was reaching for my water glass when I felt it, that familiar burning sensation in my throat. My stomach dropped. This couldn't be happening. I'd been so careful. I'd watched everything being prepared. But there's no mistaking that feeling when your body starts to shut down. It's like every alarm bell in your system goes off at once. "Something's wrong," I managed to whisper to David, my voice already getting hoarse. "What do you mean?" he asked, not even looking up from his plate. I think there might be." I couldn't finish the sentence because my throat was closing fast. That's when Jessica looked up from her own plate with an expression I'll never forget. Not concern, not alarm, but expectation, like she was waiting for something specific to happen. And that's when I knew that this wasn't an accident. The realization hit me harder than the allergic reaction itself. My daughter-in-law had deliberately tried to poison me. As my vision started to blur and my chest tightened like a vice, I could see Jessica watching me with the cold calculation of someone conducting a science experiment. She wanted to see what would happen. She wanted to prove I was faking. My hands shook as I fumbled for my purse, searching for my EpiPen while fighting to stay conscious. "David," I gasped, but he was busy telling his kids to finish their vegetables, completely oblivious to the fact that his mother was dying right next to him. "Mom?" He finally looked over, and I saw his expression change from mild irritation to genuine alarm. "Mom, what's wrong?" I couldn't answer anymore. The EpiPen fell from my trembling fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor. My grandson Lucas picked it up, his 8-year-old face scrunched in confusion. "Grandma, what's this thing?" "Oh my goodness," Jessica said, her voice dripping with false concern as she stood up slowly. "Margaret, are you having one of your episodes?" Episodes. She called my life-threatening allergic reactions episodes, like I was having a dramatic tantrum instead of fighting for my life. David was on his feet now, reaching for the EpiPen in Lucas's hands. How do I? "The thigh," I wheezed, pointing weakly at my leg. "Straight down, hard." My son had never had to use an EpiPen before because in 30 years of marriage, his father had always been the one to help me during reactions. David had watched from the sidelines, probably thinking like the rest of them that I was overreacting to everything. He jabbed the device into my thigh through my dress pants, and I felt the familiar burn of epinephrine flooding my system. It would buy me time, but not much. I needed to get to a hospital, and fast. "Call 911, I managed to say, but my voice was barely audible now. "Maybe we should just drive her," Jessica suggested calmly, like she was talking about picking up groceries. "The hospital is only 15 minutes away, and you know how long ambulances can take." 15 minutes. When you're in anaphylactic shock, 15 minutes might as well be 15 hours. And something in Jessica's tone told me that slow wasn't an accident. Thank God my grandson had more sense than the adults in the room. Lucas had already picked up Jessica's phone from the counter and was dialing 911, his small fingers surprisingly steady. "My grandma can't breathe," I heard him tell the dispatcher, his voice high with panic. "She used her medicine thing, but she's getting worse." While we waited for the ambulance, I lay on Jessica's perfectly coordinated living room sofa, studying her face as she hovered over me with theatrical concern. But her eyes were cold and calculating, like she was disappointed that the EpiPen had worked. "What did you put in the food?" I whispered, when David stepped outside to flag down the ambulance. "What are you talking about, Margaret?" Jessica's voice was honey-sweet, but there was steel underneath. "You're obviously having another one of your reactions. I hope this finally convinces you to see a specialist about these anxiety-induced symptoms." Anxiety-induced. Even as I was literally dying in her living room, she was still pushing the narrative that my allergy was psychological. The paramedics arrived like angels in blue uniforms, immediately taking my vital signs and starting an IV. My blood pressure had dropped dangerously low, and my oxygen levels were in the basement. One of them, a kind-faced woman named Carol, listened to my lungs with a stethoscope and shook her head grimly. "Severe anaphylaxis," she told her partner. "We need to move fast." As they loaded me into the ambulance, I caught a glimpse of Jessica standing in her doorway, still wearing that false expression of concern. But for just a moment, when she thought no one was looking, I saw her real face. The face of someone whose plan hadn't quite worked out the way she'd hoped. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and medical terminology I didn't understand. They gave me another shot of epinephrine, started me on steroids, and kept checking my pulse every few minutes. I drifted in and out of consciousness, but one thought kept circling through my foggy brain like a mantra. She did this on purpose. I'd been having allergic reactions for 30 years. I knew what cross-contamination felt like, what accidental exposure was like. This was different. This was stronger, more immediate, more violent than anything I'd experienced before. Whatever Jessica had put in that salad, it wasn't a trace amount of shellfish. It was intentional, concentrated, and designed to prove a point. The emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital was a whirlwind of activity. Doctors and nurses swarmed around my gurney, checking my airways, monitoring my heart rate, and pumping me full of medications with names I couldn't pronounce. Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending physician, was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who took one look at my chart and started asking pointed questions. "Mrs. Sullivan, when was your last severe reaction before tonight?" "2 years ago," I managed to croak, my voice still hoarse from the throat swelling. "And what was the exposure then?" "Cross-contamination at a restaurant. They use the same oil for shrimp and chicken." Dr. Williams frowned, making notes on her tablet. "Your reaction tonight was significantly more severe than what I'd expect from cross-contamination. Your symptoms suggest a much higher level of exposure to shellfish proteins. Higher level of exposure. Medical confirmation of what I already knew in my gut." David appeared at my bedside around midnight, looking haggard and scared. The twins were with Jessica's mother, and he'd driven to the hospital as soon as the doctors said I was stable enough for visitors. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, taking my hand in both of his. "I should have taken it more seriously when you said something was wrong. I should have known." His voice trailed off, and I could see the guilt eating at him. My son wasn't a bad person. He'd just been gradually convinced by his wife and her family that my allergy was exaggerated or psychosomatic. Gaslighting is a powerful thing, especially when it's done slowly over many years. "David," I said carefully, my voice still scratchy, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. What Jessica served tonight wasn't an accident." He pulled back slightly, his expression shifting from guilt to confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean your wife deliberately put shellfish in my food to try to prove I was faking my allergy." The silence that followed was deafening. I could practically see David's mind working, trying to reconcile what I was saying with the woman he'd married, the mother of his children, the person he shared a bed with every night. "Mom, you're upset and scared, and you've been through a trauma. Maybe you're not thinking clearly." "David," I squeezed his hand with what little strength I had left. "I've been living with this allergy for 30 years. I know the difference between an accident and something intentional. The question is, are you going to believe your wife or the medical evidence?" As if summoned by my words, Dr. Williams appeared at the foot of my bed with a clipboard and a grim expression that told me everything I needed to know. "Mr. Sullivan, I need to speak with both of you about your mother's test results." Dr. Williams pulled up a chair next to my hospital bed, her expression serious as she opened the file in her hands. "Mrs. Sullivan, we ran a comprehensive blood panel to measure the level of shellfish proteins in your system. The results are concerning." David leaned forward, suddenly very alert. "Concerning how?" "Your mother had extremely high levels of multiple shellfish allergens in her bloodstream, shrimp, crab, and lobster proteins. These levels are consistent with direct consumption of shellfish, not cross-contamination." I felt a cold satisfaction wash over me, despite the drugs making me drowsy. Finally, medical proof of what I'd been trying to tell everyone. "But that's impossible," David said, shaking his head. "Mom didn't eat any shellfish. Jessica made a completely different meal. Prime rib and salad. Dr. Williams consulted her notes again. Mr. Sullivan, I've been treating allergic reactions for 15 years. These protein levels don't lie. Your mother consumed a significant amount of shellfish tonight, whether she knew it or not. Whether she knew it or not. The implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. Doctor, I said slowly, my voice still hoarse but clearer than it had been. Is it possible that someone could have hidden shellfish in other food, ground it up, or disguised it somehow? Dr. Williams nodded grimly. Absolutely. In fact, that would explain the severity of your reaction. When shellfish is processed into small particles or powder, it can be more easily absorbed into the bloodstream, making the allergic response more intense and dangerous. David went very quiet, and I could see him processing this information. His wife, the woman he'd trusted with his children, had essentially tried to murder his mother to win an argument. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly, Dr. Williams continued, her tone becoming more formal. Mrs. Sullivan, do you have any reason to believe someone might have deliberately given you shellfish? This was it, the moment where I either spoke up or let Jessica get away with attempted murder. Yes, doctor. I believe my daughter-in-law intentionally put shellfish in my food to prove that my allergy was fake. Dr. Williams made a note on her chart. Mr. Sullivan, I'm required by law to report this to the hospital social worker and security. If someone deliberately exposed an allergy sufferer to their trigger, that's considered assault, potentially attempted murder depending on the circumstances. David's face went white. Doctor, surely there's been some misunderstanding. My wife would never— Your wife, I interrupted, finding my voice getting stronger with my anger, has been questioning my allergy for 20 years. Tonight, she got tired of wondering and decided to conduct her own little experiment with my life. Mom, that's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime, David. And if you can't see that, then you're just as guilty as she is. The words hung between us like a blade. My son sat back in his chair, running his hands through his hair, looking like a man whose entire world was crumbling, which I suppose it was. Dr. Williams stood up, closing her file. Mrs. Sullivan will need to remain here for at least another 24 hours for observation. Anaphylaxis can sometimes have a biphasic reaction, meaning symptoms can return hours after the initial treatment. We want to make sure you're completely stable before discharge. After she left, David and I sat in uncomfortable silence. The heart monitor beeped steadily in the background, and I could hear the muffled sounds of the hospital corridor outside my room. Finally, David spoke. Mom, if what you're saying is true, if Jessica really did this, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. She's my wife. She's the mother of my children. She's also someone who tried to kill me tonight to prove a point. But why? Why would she do something so extreme? I'd been thinking about this question for hours, and I finally had an answer. Because she needed to be right, David. For 20 years, she's been telling everyone that my allergy was exaggerated or fake. She's built her entire identity around being the sensible one, the rational one, the one who sees through my drama. Tonight, when faced with 30 years of medical evidence to the contrary, she couldn't admit she was wrong. So she decided to prove herself right by nearly killing me. David was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. What happens now? Now? Now the hospital investigates. Now the police get involved. Now Jessica faces the consequences of her actions. And our family? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, loved, sacrificed for, and felt a deep sadness settle in my chest. David, there was never a question about whether my allergy was real. The question was whether my family loved me enough to believe me. Tonight, I got my answer. He started to protest, but I held up my hand to stop him. You have a choice to make. You can stand by your wife and continue to pretend this was all some terrible misunderstanding. Or you can face the truth about what kind of person you married and what kind of environment you're raising your children in. It's not that simple. Actually, it is exactly that simple. Your wife tried to murder me tonight, David, in front of your children. Lucas is the one who called 911 because the adults in the room were too busy pretending nothing was wrong. The mention of his son seemed to hit David like a physical blow. Lucas had seen everything, his grandmother collapsing, his father fumbling with medical equipment he didn't understand, his mother standing calmly by as if watching a mildly interesting television show. What am I supposed to tell the kids? The truth. That grandma has a serious medical condition, that mommy did something very dangerous, and that actions have consequences. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. The kids love Jessica. She's a good mother to them. Is she? A good mother doesn't model attempted murder as conflict resolution. A good mother doesn't teach children that it's acceptable to hurt someone to prove you're right. My son turned back to me, and I could see tears in his eyes. This is going to destroy everything. No, David. Jessica destroyed everything the moment she decided my life was worth less than her need to be right. I'm just refusing to pretend otherwise anymore. The room fell silent again, broken only by the steady beeping of the heart monitor and the distant sounds of the hospital. Outside my window, I could see the city lights twinkling in the darkness, and I realized that somewhere out there, Jessica was probably sleeping peacefully in her bed, confident that her plan had worked perfectly. She had no idea that medical science had just handed me the evidence I needed to finally prove what my family had refused to believe for 30 years. She had no idea that tomorrow morning everything was going to change. But she was about to find out that trying to kill someone to win an argument comes with a price tag she never could have imagined. The next morning brought more than just breakfast trays and visiting hours. It brought Detective Maria Santos from the Westfield Police Department. She was a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that reminded me of Dr. Williams. When she introduced herself, I knew Jessica's comfortable little world was about to get very uncomfortable. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm here to follow up on the hospital's report of suspected intentional poisoning. I understand you believe someone deliberately exposed you to shellfish? I told Detective Santos the whole story. The years of doubt, Jessica's increasing skepticism, the way she'd insisted I sit at the head of the table, and most importantly, that cold, expectant look on her face as I started to collapse. I've been living with this allergy for 30 years, Detective. I know what an accident looks like. This wasn't an accident. Detective Santos took detailed notes, asking questions about the timeline, who was present, and what exactly I'd eaten. When she was finished, she closed her notebook and looked at me directly. Mrs. Sullivan, I have to tell you that proving intentional poisoning is challenging without direct evidence. However, the medical evidence is compelling, and we're going to investigate thoroughly. What does that mean exactly? It means we'll be executing a search warrant on your daughter-in-law's home to look for evidence of shellfish preparation. We'll also be interviewing everyone who was present at the dinner. The thought of police searching Jessica's pristine house, going through her perfectly organized kitchen, and questioning her in front of the neighbors filled me with a satisfaction I probably shouldn't have felt. But after 30 years of being treated like I was crazy, vindication felt pretty sweet. David arrived shortly after Detective Santos left, looking like he hadn't slept all night. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed. He slumped into the chair beside my bed without his usual greeting. "The police came to the house this morning," he said quietly. "I know. Detective Santos was just here." "Jessica, she's not handling this well." I almost laughed at the understatement. I imagine attempted murder charges would be stressful for anyone. "Mom, please. She's the mother of my children. And I'm your mother." "David, the woman she tried to kill." David rubbed his face with both hands, looking older than his 35 years. "She swears it was an accident. She says maybe there was cross-contamination in the kitchen, that she didn't know." "David." I waited until he looked at me. "They found evidence of deliberate shellfish preparation in her kitchen. Ground shrimp shells in the salad dressing, hidden in the vinaigrette so I wouldn't see or smell it." The color drained from my son's face. "What?" "The police found a food processor in your garage with shellfish residue. They found the empty shrimp packages in your neighbor's trash can, the can Jessica uses when she doesn't want you to see what she's thrown away." David stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. But why would she save evidence? Because she didn't think she was committing a crime. "David, she thought she was conducting an experiment. She thought I'd have a mild reaction, or maybe no reaction at all, and then she could finally prove to everyone that I was a liar and a drama queen. She didn't mean to hurt you. She didn't care if she hurt me. There's a difference." The silence stretched between us again, but this time it felt different. This time, I could see my son finally processing the reality of what his wife had done. "The kids are asking questions," he said finally. "Lucas keeps asking why Grandma got sick, why the police came to the house, why Mommy was crying." "What did you tell them?" "I told them Grandma had an allergic reaction and the doctors wanted to make sure everyone was safe." "And Jessica, what did she tell them?" David's jaw tightened. "She told them you were fine and that some people just like to cause drama." Even from a hospital bed, even after being arrested and questioned by police, Jessica was still pushing the narrative that I was the problem. The woman was either incredibly stupid or incredibly committed to her delusion. "David, I need you to understand something. This isn't going away. The police have evidence. The district attorney is reviewing charges. Your wife is going to face the consequences of what she did." "What kind of consequences?" I pulled out the folder, Doctor. Williams had left for me that morning. "According to the hospital's legal department, Jessica is looking at charges of assault with intent to commit bodily harm, reckless endangerment, and potentially attempted murder. She's also liable for all medical costs related to my treatment." David's face went white. "Medical costs?" I handed him the preliminary billing statement the hospital had provided. "Take a look." David's hands shook as he read the paper. "Emergency room treatment, ambulance transport, intensive care monitoring, blood work, medications, specialist consultations. It all added up quickly when someone's fighting for their life. $90,000? His voice was barely a whisper. "And that's just the first night. I'll be here for at least another day, possibly longer depending on my recovery. Plus, there will be follow-up care, new medications, additional testing. Insurance will cover it, right?" "David, when insurance companies investigate and find out that my medical emergency was caused by intentional poisoning by a family member, they're going to pursue subrogation against Jessica personally, which means she's going to be responsible for every penny." David slumped back in his chair like he'd been physically struck. "We don't have that kind of money." "I know. The house. We'd have to sell the house. We'd lose everything." "Yes, you would." The harsh reality was finally sinking in. Jessica's little experiment was going to cost them everything they owned, and probably everything they'd earn for the next decade. The perfect house in the perfect neighborhood. The luxury cars, the private school for the twins, the country club membership. All of it would have to go to pay for the consequences of her actions. "Mom," David's voice was pleading now, "isn't there something we can do? Some way to work this out privately?" "You mean, can I lie to the police and insurance companies to protect the woman who tried to kill me?" "When you put it like that, that's the only way to put it. David, your wife committed a felony. A serious, premeditated felony that could have killed me. And now you want me to cover for her to protect your lifestyle?" David was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him struggling with a decision that would define the rest of his relationship with his mother, his wife, and his children. What happens to Lucas and Emma if Jessica goes to prison? They come live with you. Or with me if you decide to stand by your wife instead of doing what's right. You'd take them. David, those children are innocent victims in all this. Of course I'd take them. But I won't pretend their mother isn't a dangerous person who tried to commit murder to win an argument. My son sat in silence for several minutes, staring out the hospital window at the parking lot below. I could see him wrestling with 20 years of marriage, 2 children, and the complete destruction of everything he'd thought he knew about the woman he'd married. Finally, he looked back at me with tears in his eyes. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have believed you all these years. I should have protected you instead of doubting you. I know you're sorry." "David, the question is, what are you going to do now?" But before he could answer, there was a knock on my hospital room door that would change everything once again. The knock belonged to Jessica's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man in his 60s named Robert Klein, who introduced himself with the kind of oily confidence that made my skin crawl. He was followed by Jessica herself, who looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her designer clothes had been replaced with jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt. "Mrs. Sullivan," Mr. Klein said smoothly, "my client would like to speak with you about the unfortunate incident that occurred last night." "Unfortunate incident?" I looked at Jessica, who couldn't quite meet my eyes. "Is that what we're calling attempted murder now?" "Now, Mrs. Sullivan, let's not be dramatic. My client made a simple mistake in food preparation. Cross-contamination happens in kitchens every day. I held up the police report Detective Santos had left with me. Mr. Klein, your client deliberately ground up shrimp shells and mixed them into salad dressing. She then disposed of the evidence in a neighbor's trash can and stored the food processor in her garage. That's not cross-contamination. That's premeditated poisoning. Jessica finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret, I never meant for it to go this far. I just wanted to prove. You wanted to prove I was a liar, and you were willing to risk my life to do it. I didn't think you'd have such a bad reaction. I thought maybe you'd feel a little sick, and then we'd know for sure. The casual admission stunned everyone in the room into silence. Even her lawyer looked shocked that she'd just confessed to intentional poisoning in front of witnesses. Jessica, Mr. Klein said urgently, I strongly advise you not to say another word. But Jessica was past the point of taking good advice. 20 years of built-up resentment and frustration came pouring out like water through a broken dam. Do you know what it's like to plan every family dinner around someone else's supposed medical condition? Do you know how embarrassing it is to have to explain to friends why we can't go to nice restaurants because Margaret might have one of her episodes? My episodes? I sat up straighter in bed. My anger overriding the pain medication. You mean my life-threatening allergic reactions? I've seen you eat at places that serve seafood. I've seen you at the country club when they're serving surf and turf. Because I call ahead, Jessica. Because I speak to the chef. Because I take precautions that allow me to exist in the world without dying. David finally found his voice. Jessica, stop talking. You're making this worse. Worse? It can't get any worse, David. Your mother is destroying our family because she can't admit that her allergy isn't as serious as she pretends. I stared at my daughter-in-law in amazement. Even now, even with medical evidence and police reports and criminal charges, she still believed I was the problem. Jessica, I said calmly, I nearly died last night. I was in the ICU for 8 hours. The doctor said if Lucas hadn't called 911 when he did, I would have died on your living room floor. But you didn't die. You're fine. I'm fine because of emergency medical intervention that cost $90,000. $90,000 that you're personally responsible for because you committed a felony. That's when Jessica's composure finally cracked completely. She turned to David with desperation in her eyes. David, you have to make her understand. We can't lose the house. We can't lose everything because of one mistake. One mistake? David's voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. Jessica, you tried to kill my mother. I did not. I was just trying to prove she was exaggerating. By poisoning her. By giving her a tiny amount of shellfish to see if anything would really happen. Mr. Klein put his hand on Jessica's arm. Mrs. Sullivan, please. You're not helping your case. But Jessica shook him off, turning back to me with a look of pure desperation. Margaret, please. We've had our differences, but we're family. Can't we work something out? Can't you tell the police this was all a misunderstanding? I looked at this woman who had spent 20 years questioning my medical condition, undermining my credibility, and making family gatherings into battlegrounds. This woman who had decided that proving she was right was more important than my life. Jessica, do you know what the worst part of this whole thing is? She shook her head, tears starting to stream down her face. The worst part is that for 30 years, I've been carrying an EpiPen everywhere I go. For 30 years, I've been checking ingredient lists and calling restaurants and avoiding certain foods because I know that one mistake could kill me. And for 20 of those years, you've been telling everyone I was being dramatic. I was wrong, okay? I admit it. I was wrong. You weren't wrong, Jessica. You were dangerous. And last night, you proved just how dangerous you really are. Jessica turned to David one last time, her voice breaking. David, please, don't let her destroy our family. My son looked at his wife for a long moment, and I could see him making the decision that would define the rest of his life. When he spoke, his voice was steady and final. Jessica, you destroyed our family the moment you decided to poison my mother. I can't live with someone who would do something like that. I can't raise my children with someone who thinks attempted murder is an acceptable way to win an argument. The silence that followed was deafening. Jessica stared at David like he'd physically struck her, while her lawyer quietly gathered his papers and headed for the door. "David," Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. "I'll be staying at my mother's house tonight. We'll arrange for you to get some things. But I want you out of the house by the weekend." "You can't do this! You can't take my children away from me!" "I can, and I will. No judge in the world is going to give custody to someone facing attempted murder charges." As Jessica dissolved into hysterical sobs and her lawyer ushered her out of the room, I felt a complex mix of emotions: satisfaction that justice was finally being served, sadness that my family was being torn apart, and relief that the truth had finally come to light. David sank back into the chair beside my bed, looking exhausted but somehow lighter than he had in years. "Mom, I'm sorry it took so long for me to see who she really was. I'm just glad you finally did, sweetheart. And I'm glad you're putting the children's safety first. What happens now?" I looked out the window at the sunny afternoon sky, thinking about 8-year-old twins who would need help understanding why their mother wasn't coming home, and a son who would need support rebuilding his life after 20 years of marriage to a woman who turned out to be capable of attempted murder. Now we heal, David, all of us, and we make sure this never happens to anyone else in our family again. But as I watched Jessica's lawyer's car pull out of the hospital parking lot, I knew that the real consequences of her actions were just beginning. The bills were mounting, the legal proceedings were just getting started, and somewhere out there, a woman who had tried to kill me to prove a point was about to learn that actions have consequences she never could have imagined. The justice was just beginning, and honestly, I couldn't wait to see how it all played out. The Family That Never Believed. Chapters 6-10. 3 weeks after Jessica's arrest, I was sitting in my favorite armchair reading the morning paper when the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I could see a nervous-looking young man in an expensive suit clutching a briefcase like it was a life preserver. "Mrs. Sullivan? I'm Bradley Morrison from Morrison, Pearson Associates. We represent Jessica Sullivan's insurance company." Of course they did. I invited him in, curious to see what kind of deal they thought they could offer the woman who'd nearly been murdered by their client's wife. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'll be direct. Our client's policy doesn't cover intentional criminal acts, which means Jessica Sullivan is personally liable for all damages related to your medical treatment. I'm aware of that." "Mr. Morrison." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, opening his briefcase and pulling out a thick folder. "The current total, including ongoing treatment and rehabilitation, is approaching $127,000. $127,000. The irony wasn't lost on me. That was almost exactly what I'd given Rebecca and Richard over the years, money they'd claimed was essential for their survival, but had somehow found its way to luxury vacations and designer furniture. However, Mr. Morrison continued, "Our company is prepared to offer a settlement that would benefit everyone involved." "I'm listening." "We'll pay your medical bills in full, plus an additional $50,000 for pain and suffering in exchange for your agreement not to pursue civil litigation against Jessica Sullivan." I leaned back in my chair, studying this young man who clearly thought he was dealing with a confused elderly woman who could be easily manipulated. "Mr. Morrison, let me make sure I understand. You want to pay me $177,000 to pretend your client's wife didn't try to murder me?" "We prefer to think of it as resolving the matter efficiently for all parties. And what happens to Jessica's criminal charges? Those are separate from our settlement offer. We have no influence over the district attorney's office." Smart lawyers. They knew Jessica was going down for the criminal charges, so they wanted to limit the financial damage before civil court could really punish her. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate you coming here today, but I'm going to decline your generous offer." His confident expression faltered. "Mrs. Sullivan, I should mention that civil litigation can be a lengthy and expensive process. There's no guarantee you'd recover more than we're offering today. Maybe not. But there is a guarantee that Jessica will face the full consequences of her actions, both criminal and financial. Think about your family, your son and grandchildren. Prolonged legal proceedings will be difficult for everyone involved. You know what was difficult, Mr. Morrison? Nearly dying because someone decided to conduct a science experiment with my life. You know what else was difficult? 30 years of being told I was exaggerating a medical condition that could kill me." Mr. Morrison gathered his papers, clearly realizing his mission had failed. If you change your mind, the offer stands for 48 hours. After he left, I called David to let him know about the insurance company's visit. He was at work, but picked up immediately. He'd been checking on me constantly since Jessica's arrest. "Mom, $177,000 is a lot of money. Are you sure you don't want to consider it?" "David, this was never about money. This was about your wife thinking my life was worth less than proving she was right." "I know, but the kids, this whole legal process is going to drag on for months. Lucas keeps asking when Mommy's coming home, and Emma won't stop crying at bedtime. The children. My heart ached for those 8-year-old twins who couldn't understand why their mother was suddenly gone, why their father looked sad all the time, why their grandmother was in the hospital. They were the innocent victims in Jessica's war against reality. "David, bring the twins over this afternoon. It's time they understood what really happened." "Mom, they're only 8. How do I explain that their mother tried to hurt their grandmother?" "Very carefully. But they deserve the truth, and they need to understand that actions have consequences." That afternoon, Lucas and Emma sat on my living room floor playing with blocks while David paced nervously by the window. I'd been thinking all day about how to explain attempted murder to 2 8-year-olds without traumatizing them. "Lucas, Emma, come sit with Grandma for a minute." They climbed up on the couch on either side of me, their small faces serious. Lucas had David's eyes, while Emma looked exactly like Jessica had at that age: blonde hair, delicate features, and an intelligence that sometimes seemed too mature for her years. "Do you remember when Grandma got sick at your house?" I asked gently. "When you couldn't breathe," Lucas said quietly. "I called 911. You did the right thing, sweetheart. You probably saved my life." Emma spoke for the first time since arriving. "Daddy says Mommy is in trouble with the police." "That's right, honey. Your mom made a very bad choice that hurt Grandma." "But why?" Lucas asked, his voice small and confused. "Why would Mommy want to hurt you? How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his mother spent 20 years convinced that his grandmother was a liar? How do you make a child understand that some adults are so committed to being right that they'll risk someone's life to prove it? Sometimes adults make mistakes, Lucas, really big mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes hurt people we love." "Is Mommy coming home?" Emma whispered, tears starting to form in her eyes. David sat down across from us, his own eyes wet. "Not for a while, sweetheart. Mommy has to face the consequences for what she did." "What are consequences?" Lucas asked. "Consequences are what happen when you make bad choices," I explained. "Like when you don't do your homework, the consequence is getting in trouble at school. When adults make really bad choices that hurt people, the consequences are much more serious." Emma climbed into my lap, something she hadn't done since she was much smaller. "Grandma, are you going to die?" "No, baby. Grandma is fine now. The doctors fixed me up, and I'm going to be around to annoy you for many more years." That got a small smile from both children, which was what I'd been hoping for. "Are we going to live here now?" Lucas asked, looking around my living room. David answered that one. "For a while, yes. Would that be okay with you?" Lucas nodded solemnly. "I like it here. Grandma has better snacks than Mommy." Despite everything, I laughed. Leave it to an 8-year-old to find the practical advantages in a family crisis. That evening, after the children were settled in the guest rooms and David had gone to his old bedroom, I sat alone in my kitchen thinking about the choices that lay ahead. The insurance company's offer was substantial, but taking it would mean letting Jessica escape the full weight of her actions. It would mean teaching Lucas and Emma that attempted murder was just another mistake that money could fix. But there was something else troubling me, something that had been nagging at the back of my mind since Jessica's confession in the hospital. Her certainty that I was faking, her detailed knowledge of my restaurant visits, her confidence that she could prove I was lying. It all suggested a level of surveillance and planning that went beyond casual doubt. I walked to my laptop and opened my email, scrolling through months of family correspondence, birthday party invitations, holiday planning, school events, all the normal chatter of family life. But as I read more carefully, I started to notice a pattern. Jessica had been asking very specific questions about my activities. Where was I eating? Who was I with? What precautions was I taking? At the time, I'd thought she was finally showing interest in my condition. Now I realized she'd been gathering evidence to use against me. But the most chilling discovery came when I opened a group text thread from 3 months ago. David had mentioned that I'd eaten at a seafood restaurant for my friend Helen's birthday, and Jessica had immediately responded with multiple questions about how I'd managed to eat safely. I scrolled down to see David's response. Mom called ahead and spoke to the chef. They prepared her meal separately and used different utensils. She does this everywhere we go. Jessica's response, sent an hour later, was a single word: interesting. At the time, I thought she was finally beginning to understand the reality of living with a severe allergy. Now I realized she'd been planning my attempted murder for months. I was about to close the laptop when one final message caught my eye. It was from Jessica to David, sent just 2 days before the dinner party. David, I've been thinking about your mother's allergy situation. I think it's time we got some clarity on this once and for all. I have an idea for how we can handle it at your birthday dinner. My blood ran cold. There it was, in writing, premeditation. Jessica hadn't acted in a moment of impulse or frustration. She'd planned to poison me, and she'd been calculating enough to document her intentions in text messages. I immediately forwarded the screenshot to Detective Santos and my lawyer. This wasn't just attempted murder anymore. This was conspiracy, and the evidence was about to change everything. Detective Santos arrived at my house the next morning with a warrant for Jessica's phone records and a very serious expression. She showed me the text message thread I'd found, now printed out and marked as evidence. Mrs. Sullivan, this changes everything. Premeditation elevates this from assault to attempted murder in the first degree. What does that mean in terms of sentencing? 25 years to life. 25 years to life. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction. Jessica had gambled my life on her need to be right, and now she was going to pay the full price for that bet. There's something else, Detective Santos continued, pulling out another folder. We've been investigating Jessica's background as part of the case, and we found some interesting information. What kind of information? She has a history of this behavior. In college, she deliberately gave a peanut-allergic roommate peanut oil in her food to test whether the allergy was real. My stomach dropped. What happened to the roommate? Emergency hospitalization. The girl nearly died. Jessica was expelled from school and faced criminal charges, but the case was eventually dropped when the victim's family accepted a financial settlement. So Jessica has done this before. According to the records, yes. The pattern is identical. Doubt someone's medical condition, conduct an unauthorized test, nearly kill them, and then claim it was an accident. I sank back in my chair, processing this information. My daughter-in-law wasn't just someone who'd made a terrible mistake. She was a predator who targeted people with medical conditions, someone who got some kind of satisfaction from proving they were fake by nearly killing them. Detective, does David know about this? We planned to interview him today about his knowledge of his wife's history. David didn't know. In all the years they'd been together, Jessica had never mentioned that she'd been expelled from college for attempted murder. She'd built their entire marriage on a lie, presenting herself as a rational, skeptical person when she was actually someone with a documented pattern of trying to kill people to prove a point. When Detective Santos left, I called David immediately. David, you need to come over here right now, and you need to be sitting down when I tell you what the police just discovered. 20 minutes later, my son sat in my living room reading Jessica's college disciplinary records with an expression of growing horror. She never told me any of this, he whispered. She said she transferred colleges because of academic reasons. David, she's done this before. She's a serial attempted murderer who targets people with allergies. But why did she marry me? Why have children with me if she had this? This obsession with my mother's medical condition? I'd been wondering the same thing. I think she married you because of my allergy, not despite it. I think she saw me as a long-term project, someone she could eventually expose as a fraud. You're saying she spent 20 years planning to poison you? I'm saying she spent 20 years studying me, gathering evidence, and waiting for the right moment to prove she was smarter than an entire medical establishment. David put his head in his hands. What kind of person does that? What kind of mother? The kind who shouldn't have custody of children. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following week. David's lawyer had assured him that with Jessica facing attempted murder charges, getting sole custody would be straightforward. But I had a feeling Jessica wasn't going to go down without a fight. I was right. The day before the hearing, Jessica's new lawyer, a different one than the oily Mr. Klein, filed a motion claiming that I had manipulated the evidence and coerced confessions through emotional manipulation. According to their filing, I was a controlling, dramatic woman who had convinced my son to turn against his wife because I couldn't accept that my allergy might be psychosomatic. When David showed me the court papers, I actually laughed out loud. They're still claiming I made it all up? Apparently. Jessica's lawyer is arguing that you planted the evidence in her kitchen and coached the children to lie about what they saw. David, there are medical records going back 30 years. There are police reports, hospital bills, and chemical analysis of my blood. What part of that am I supposed to have faked? According to this, you've been planning to frame Jessica for years because you wanted to break up our marriage and get custody of the grandchildren. The accusation was so absurd, so completely detached from reality, that I realized Jessica truly believed her own delusions. In her mind, she was the victim of an elaborate conspiracy orchestrated by a manipulative mother-in-law who had somehow convinced doctors, police, and laboratory technicians to participate in a decades-long fraud. She's insane, I said finally. Literally, clinically insane. The scary part is, I think she actually believes it, David replied. When I visited her in jail yesterday, she spent the whole time explaining how you'd manipulated everyone against her. She's convinced that you're some kind of criminal mastermind who faked a 30-year medical condition just to destroy her life. Did you tell her about her college records? I tried. She said those were planted too. She said you somehow altered her educational records to make her look bad. I stared at my son in amazement. Jessica's delusion was complete and impenetrable. Rather than face the reality that she was a serial attempted murderer, she'd constructed an elaborate fantasy where I was a criminal genius who had spent decades planning her downfall. David, there's something I need to ask you, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay. In 20 years of marriage, did Jessica ever show any signs of this level of detachment from reality? David was quiet for a long moment, thinking. There were things, he said finally. Little things I dismissed at the time? She would get fixated on proving people wrong about minor things. She once spent 6 months trying to prove that our neighbor was lying about having diabetes. What happened? She would watch him through the window, documenting everything he ate, trying to catch him eating sugar. She even went through his trash looking for candy wrappers. And you didn't think that was strange? I thought she was just thorough, detail-oriented. I thought it was admirable that she didn't just accept things at face value. David, that's not detail-oriented. That's stalking. I know that now. But at the time, she was so confident, so sure of herself, that I just assumed she knew what she was doing. Gaslighting. Jessica had spent 20 years gradually normalizing her obsessive, predatory behavior by presenting it as intellectual curiosity and healthy skepticism. She'd trained my son to see her surveillance and harassment as positive traits, preparing him to support her when she finally decided to escalate to attempted murder. There's one more thing, David said hesitantly. Something I've been afraid to tell you. What? Last year, Jessica started asking questions about your will. She wanted to know what would happen to your assets if something happened to you. My blood ran cold. What kind of questions? Whether you had life insurance, whether the house would go to me, whether there were any debts that would need to be settled. She said she was helping me plan for the future, making sure we'd be able to take care of the kids if we inherited unexpected financial responsibilities. David, she was planning to kill me for money. I don't know. Maybe. She also asked about your medical records, whether they'd be sealed if you died, whether anyone would be able to review your treatment history. She wanted to destroy the evidence of my allergy after I was dead. The scope of Jessica's planning was breathtaking. She hadn't just wanted to prove I was faking my allergy. She'd wanted to kill me, inherit my assets, and then discredit my medical history posthumously to support her narrative that I'd been a fraud all along. David, your wife isn't just dangerous. She's a sociopath. I know. His voice was barely a whisper. I've been thinking about all the signs I missed, all the red flags I ignored because I loved her. You couldn't have known. Sociopaths are experts at hiding their true nature from the people closest to them. But the kids, Mom, what if she'd eventually turned on them? What if one of them had developed an allergy or a medical condition she didn't believe in? That possibility hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. Lucas and Emma, sleeping peacefully upstairs, had been living with a woman who was capable of attempted murder disguised as skepticism. The kids are safe now, I said finally. That's what matters. But as I said it, I realized there was one more revelation coming that would make everything else pale in comparison. Because the next morning, I was going to discover that Jessica's plan had been even more elaborate than any of us had imagined. The call came at 6 a.m. It was Detective Santos, and her voice was grim. "Mrs. Sullivan, we need to talk." "Can I come over right away?" "Of course. What's happened?" "I'd rather discuss it in person." An hour later, Detective Santos sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee and a file folder that seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. "Mrs. Sullivan, our investigation into Jessica's background has revealed some additional information that I think you need to know." "More victims?" "In a sense. We've discovered that Jessica has been systematically researching your medical history for the past 5 years. She's been contacting your doctor's offices, your pharmacy, even your insurance company, claiming to be your daughter-in-law updating emergency contact information." I set down my coffee cup. "What kind of information was she after?" "Everything. Prescription records, doctor's notes, test results, emergency room visits. She's been building a comprehensive file on your allergy to identify what she called inconsistencies in your treatment." "Inconsistencies?" "Apparently. She was looking for evidence that your allergy was psychosomatic. She documented every time you ate at a restaurant that served seafood, every time you went to a social event where shellfish might be present, every time you lived normally instead of hiding at home in fear." Detective Santos opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "This is Jessica's research file on you. She's been keeping detailed records for years." I flipped through the pages, my horror growing with each document. Jessica had copies of my medical records going back decades, detailed timelines of every allergic reaction I'd ever had, maps of restaurants I'd visited, and even photographs she'd taken of me at social events. She's been stalking me for 5 years. It appears so. And Mrs. Sullivan, there's more. We found evidence that she was planning to publish this information. Publish it? She'd been writing what she called an exposé about fake allergies and the medical establishment that enables them. You were going to be her case study. Detective Santos handed me a printed email. "This is from Jessica to a literary agent sent 3 weeks before she poisoned you." I read the email with growing disbelief. "Dear Ms. Hartwell, I'm writing to propose a non-fiction book about the epidemic of fake medical conditions in America. Through my extensive research into one family member's supposed shellfish allergy, I've uncovered a pattern of deception, manipulation, and medical fraud that extends far beyond individual cases. I believe this book could expose the truth about how easily our healthcare system can be manipulated by convincing liars. My research includes 5 years of documentation and will culminate in definitive proof that this particular allergy is entirely psychological." I looked up at Detective Santos. She was going to write a book about me. A book calling you a liar and a fraud. Yes, and according to her notes, she planned to include medical records obtained without your consent, photographs taken without your knowledge, and detailed analysis of your deceptive behavior. That's why she needed to prove I was faking. She needed a dramatic conclusion for her book. Exactly. The poisoning wasn't just about winning an argument with her family. It was going to be the climactic chapter of her exposé, the moment she definitively proved that a 30-year medical fraud was all psychological. I sat back in my chair, trying to process the magnitude of Jessica's betrayal. She hadn't just tried to kill me on impulse. She'd been planning it for years as part of an elaborate scheme to profit from my humiliation and near death. "Detective, what happens now?" "Well, identity theft, medical fraud, stalking, and invasion of privacy charges will be added to the attempted murder charges. We're also investigating whether she violated federal HIPAA laws by obtaining your medical records under false pretenses. And the literary agent? She's cooperating fully with the investigation. Apparently, she was disturbed enough by Jessica's proposal to file a complaint with the police even before we contacted her. David came downstairs just as Detective Santos was leaving, his hair disheveled and his eyes still heavy with sleep. "What's going on?" I heard voices. I handed him Jessica's email to the literary agent without saying a word. David read it twice before setting it down on the kitchen table like it was contaminated. "She was going to write a book about you. A book calling me a liar and detailing how she proved it by nearly killing me. This is insane. This is absolutely insane. David, your wife spent our entire marriage studying me like a lab rat, planning to poison me, and writing a book about it. And you lived with her for 20 years without knowing any of this. How could I have known? How could anyone have known? I'm not blaming you. I'm just trying to understand how someone can compartmentalize that level of deception." David slumped into a chair across from me. "Mom, I keep thinking about all the times she encouraged me to doubt you. All the little comments about your episodes, all the suggestions that maybe you were being overly cautious. She was manipulating me to build her case against you. She was manipulating everyone. The doctor's offices, the insurance companies, even that literary agent. And the kids. Oh God, the kids." I looked at him. "What about the kids?" "She was planning to include them in the book. I saw some of her notes last night when I was packing up her office. She had sections about how your fake allergy was traumatizing the grandchildren, how we were enabling your attention-seeking behavior. She was going to exploit Lucas and Emma for her book? She was going to present them as victims of your psychological manipulation." The scope of Jessica's plan was staggering. She'd intended to destroy my reputation, profit from my near-death experience, and use my own grandchildren as evidence against me in a book that would have been distributed nationally. David, what if she hadn't been caught? What if I died that night? Then she would have written about how your fake allergy claims finally caught up with you, how you died because you couldn't admit you were lying and get proper psychological treatment. She would have painted my death as suicide. Worse, she would have painted it as the inevitable result of living a lie for 30 years. I thought about Lucas and Emma, sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware that their mother had been planning to exploit their grief and confusion for profit. They would have grown up reading a book that portrayed their grandmother as a manipulative liar who died because she couldn't face the truth about herself. David, we can't let the children know about the book. No, absolutely not. They don't need to know that their mother was planning to profit from your death. When they're older, when they can understand the full scope of what she did, then we can decide how much to tell them, if we tell them at all. That afternoon, I sat in my garden thinking about the strange trajectory my life had taken. 6 weeks ago, I'd been a grandmother dealing with a skeptical daughter-in-law and some family tensions. Now I was the target of an attempted murder that had been 5 years in the planning, and the subject of a proposed book that would have destroyed my reputation and exploited my grandchildren's trauma. But there was one more surprise coming, one final revelation that would put everything in perspective and make me realize that Jessica's punishment was going to be far more fitting than anything I could have planned myself. Because tomorrow, I was going to discover that the literary agent Jessica had contacted wasn't the only person she'd approached about her project. The revelation came from the most unexpected source, my insurance agent, Harold Mackenzie, who called me that afternoon with an unusual request. "Maggie, I've got something strange here. About 6 months ago, someone contacted our office claiming to be researching insurance fraud related to fake medical conditions. They wanted information about your claims history." "Someone? Who?" "Well, that's the strange part. She said she was a journalist working on a book about medical fraud, and she specifically mentioned your case as an example she was investigating." My blood ran cold. "Harold, what exactly did she want to know?" "Everything. How much we'd paid out for your allergy-related claims over the years, whether we'd ever investigated the legitimacy of your condition, whether we considered you a high-risk client." "And what did you tell her?" "Nothing, of course. I told her that client information is confidential and that if she had legitimate research purposes, she'd need to go through proper legal channels with your written consent. Harold, the woman who called you was my daughter-in-law. She was planning to poison me and write a book about it." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. "Maggie, Are you saying that someone tried to commit insurance fraud by researching your legitimate medical claims? I'm saying Jessica was building a case to prove I was a fraud, and she was planning to include insurance information in her exposé. Well, then she's about to discover something very interesting about insurance fraud investigations. What do you mean? When someone contacts an insurance company asking detailed questions about a specific client's medical claims, we're required to file a report with the State Insurance Fraud Division. Your daughter-in-law triggered a formal investigation into potential medical fraud. An investigation of me? An investigation of her. Insurance fraud works both ways, Maggie. It's just as illegal to falsely accuse someone of fraud as it is to commit fraud. And when the investigators review your 30-year claims history and compare it to the evidence she was supposedly gathering, they're going to find that you've been completely honest and that she was the one attempting to manipulate the system. Harold's words were sinking in slowly. Jessica's attempt to prove I was committing insurance fraud had backfired spectacularly, triggering a real fraud investigation that was going to land squarely on her. Harold, what are the penalties for false fraud accusations? Depending on the scope and intent, anywhere from massive fines to federal charges. And if they determine that she was planning to profit from false accusations, say by writing a book, that becomes racketeering. Racketeering? Using false information to generate income through fraud accusations. It's a federal crime, Maggie. Your daughter-in-law may be looking at much more than attempted murder charges. That evening, I called Detective Santos to share Harold's information. She listened quietly, taking notes, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Sullivan, this case keeps getting more complex. We're now looking at potential federal charges in addition to the state charges. What does that mean for Jessica's sentencing? If the federal government decides to prosecute, she could be looking at decades in prison across multiple jurisdictions. Insurance fraud, medical fraud, identity theft, racketeering. The federal penalties alone could be 20 to 30 years. 20 to 30 years. Plus the state charges for attempted murder, stalking, and invasion of privacy. Jessica's need to prove she was right about my allergy was going to cost her most of her remaining life. Detective, there's something else I need to ask you. What's that? Has anyone contacted Jessica's college roommate? The girl she poisoned 20 years ago? We reached out to her yesterday. She's agreed to testify in both the criminal and civil proceedings. How is she doing? She's a doctor now, actually. An allergist. She says what happened to her in college inspired her to specialize in severe allergic reactions. The irony was almost poetic. Jessica's first victim had become a medical professional dedicated to treating the exact condition Jessica thought was fake. And now she was going to testify against Jessica as both a victim and an expert witness. Mrs. Sullivan, there's one more thing. Dr. Hammond, that's the roommate, wanted me to ask if she could meet with you. She says she's been following your case in the news, and she'd like to discuss something with you. Of course, I'd be honored to meet her. The meeting was arranged for the following Saturday at my home. Dr. Sarah Hammond turned out to be a warm, intelligent woman in her early 40s who carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived trauma and turned it into purpose. Mrs. Sullivan, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you survived Jessica's attack and that she's finally being held accountable for what she does. Dr. Hammond, I'm so sorry you went through this 20 years ago. Please call me Sarah, and don't apologize for Jessica's actions. I've spent 20 years in therapy learning that I'm not responsible for what she did to me. Sarah, can I ask what happened back then? The police reports were somewhat limited. Sarah settled into my living room chair, her expression becoming serious. Jessica was my roommate sophomore year. I had a severe peanut allergy, and I was very open about it. I had to be for safety reasons. But Jessica became obsessed with testing, whether it was real. Testing how? At first, it was small things. She'd buy peanut products and leave them around our room to see if I'd react to the smell. She'd ask me detailed questions about my medical history, my childhood, my family. She claimed she was pre-med and was interested in learning about allergies. But it escalated. Over the course of months, she became convinced that my allergy was psychological. She'd make little comments about how I seemed fine around certain foods, how my reactions seemed convenient when I wanted to avoid social situations. Exactly what she did to me. Then she decided to prove her theory. She ground up peanuts and mixed them into a pasta salad she made for dinner one night. She watched me eat it, watching for my reaction. What happened? I nearly died. My throat closed completely. My blood pressure dropped to almost nothing, and I was in the ICU for 4 days. The only reason I survived was because our RA happened to walk by our room right after I collapsed. And Jessica? She claimed it was cross-contamination, that she'd made the pasta salad in a kitchen where someone had recently used peanut products. She was very convincing, very tearful, very apologetic. But you knew it was intentional. I knew, but I couldn't prove it. And Jessica had spent months building a narrative about how my allergy made me paranoid and attention-seeking. Even some of my friends wondered if I was overreacting to an accident. That's exactly what she did to me. The difference is, you had 30 years of medical documentation and family members who witnessed her behavior. I was 19 and had only been living with my allergy for a few years. Sarah, what made you decide to become an allergist? She smiled for the first time since she'd started talking. I realized that if people like Jessica existed, people who thought they could test someone's medical condition, then there needed to be more doctors who understood the psychological and social aspects of living with severe allergies. You turned your trauma into healing for others. I've treated hundreds of patients over the years who've been doubted, questioned, or gaslit by family members about their allergies. I always tell them about my college experience, about how someone's disbelief nearly killed me, and how they don't have to prove their condition to anyone. That's beautiful work. Sarah, Mrs. Sullivan, I wanted to meet you because I have a proposition. I'm listening. I'd like to co-write a book with you. Not an exposé like Jessica was planning, but a resource for allergy sufferers and their families about the reality of living with invisible disabilities and the importance of believing people about their medical conditions. The irony was perfect. Jessica had planned to write a book calling me a fraud, and instead, her actions were going to result in a book that helped people in situations like ours. Sarah, I would be honored to work with you on that. There's one more thing. I've been in contact with several other women who were targeted by Jessica over the years. Other women? She's been doing this for 20 years. Mrs. Sullivan, you and I weren't her only victims. My heart sank. How many others? We've identified at least 4 other cases where Jessica befriended someone with a medical condition, questioned their diagnosis, and eventually tried to prove they were faking. Did anyone else nearly die? 2 others were hospitalized. One woman with celiac disease was given gluten-containing food at a dinner party Jessica hosted. Another woman with a severe latex allergy was given latex gloves that Jessica told her were latex-free. She's been attempting murder for 20 years. And getting away with it by presenting herself as a rational skeptic, exposing medical fraud. The full scope of Jessica's crimes was finally becoming clear. She wasn't just my daughter-in-law who'd made a terrible mistake. She was a serial attempted murderer who had refined her methods over 20 years, targeting vulnerable people with medical conditions and nearly killing them to satisfy her need to be right. But tomorrow, I was going to learn that justice sometimes takes forms you never could have imagined. The call came from David on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after Jessica's arrest. His voice was shaky, and I could tell he'd been crying. Mom, Jessica's lawyer just called. She wants to take a plea deal. What kind of plea deal? Guilty to all charges in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole. I sat down hard in my kitchen chair. Life in prison. Jessica, the woman who'd spent 20 years eating dinner at my table and playing with my grandchildren, was going to die behind bars for what she'd done to me and her other victims. David, are you okay? I don't know. Part of me feels relieved that it's finally over, that we don't have to go through a trial with the kids. But part of me still can't believe the woman I married was capable of this. When will she be sentenced? Next week. The judge wants to hear victim impact statements before accepting the plea. Victim impact statements. The opportunity to tell Jessica, in front of a judge and court reporters and permanent legal record, exactly what her actions had cost me, my family, and her other victims. I spent the next week writing and rewriting my statement, trying to capture 30 years of living with doubt, 20 years of being gaslit by my own family, and the terror of nearly dying because someone thought my medical condition was inconvenient for their worldview. The courthouse was packed on sentencing day. Sarah was there, along with 3 other women Jessica had targeted over the years. David sat in the front row with Lucas and Emma, who were still too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to know that their mother was never coming home. Jessica looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of her crimes. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw no remorse, no recognition of the harm she'd caused. Even now, even facing life in prison, she still looked at me like I was the problem. Judge Patricia Williams, no relation to the doctor who'd saved my life, called for victim impact statements. Sarah spoke first, describing how Jessica's attack in college had shaped her entire career and her understanding of trust and betrayal. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium and looked directly at Jessica as I began to speak. Your Honor, for 30 years, I lived with a medical condition that could kill me at any moment. But for the last 20 of those years, I also lived with something equally dangerous, a family member who was determined to prove that my condition was fake. Jessica Sullivan didn't just try to murder me 3 months ago. She conducted a 20-year campaign to undermine my credibility, question my honesty, and convince my family that I was a liar seeking attention. She turned family dinners into interrogations, social gatherings into investigations, and my son's home into a place where I was constantly on trial for the crime of having a medical condition she found inconvenient. But the worst part wasn't the doubt, or the gaslighting, or even the attempt on my life. The worst part was watching my own son learn to question everything I said, because the woman he loved had taught him that his mother was a fraud. Jessica didn't just try to kill my body, Your Honor. She spent 20 years trying to kill my relationship with my family, my credibility in my community, and my right to exist safely in the world with a documented medical condition. She failed on all counts. I survived her attack. My family now understands the truth, and my medical condition has been validated by every court, every doctor, and every expert who has reviewed the evidence. But dozens of other families are living with the doubt she planted, wondering if their loved ones' medical conditions are as fake as Jessica claimed mine was. Jessica Sullivan is not a skeptical daughter-in-law who went too far. She is a serial attempted murderer who has spent 20 years refining her methods and targeting vulnerable people with medical conditions. She belongs in prison not just for what she did to me, but for what she would have continued to do to others if she hadn't been stopped. I ask that you accept her plea agreement and ensure that she never has the opportunity to harm another person the way she harmed me, my family, and her other victims. When I returned to my seat, David reached over and took my hand. Judge Williams addressed Jessica directly. Ms. Sullivan, you have pleaded guilty to attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, identity theft, stalking, and multiple violations of federal privacy laws. Your actions represent one of the most calculated and prolonged attempts at psychological and physical harm this court has ever seen. Your targeting of individuals with medical conditions, your systematic undermining of their credibility, and your ultimate decision to risk their lives to prove your unfounded theories represent a level of cruelty that defies comprehension. I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $2.3 million to your various victims for medical costs, emotional distress, and punitive damages. I hope that your remaining years in prison give you time to reflect on the harm you've caused and the lives you've destroyed in pursuit of your need to be right at any cost. $2.3 million. Jessica's need to prove I was lying about my allergy was going to cost her everything she owned and everything she might ever earn for the rest of her life. As the bailiffs led Jessica away in shackles, she turned back to look at me one last time. Even now, even after pleading guilty to attempting to murder me, her expression wasn't one of remorse or regret. It was one of frustration, as if she still couldn't understand how her perfect plan had gone so wrong. 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen making Sunday dinner for David, Lucas, and Emma. The children had adapted remarkably well to their new life, though Emma still had nightmares sometimes, and Lucas occasionally asked when Mommy would be allowed to visit. We'd started seeing a family therapist who specialized in helping children process parental incarceration. Dr. Martinez had explained that children Jessica's age often struggled with the concept that their mother had done something irreversibly harmful, and that it would take years for them to fully understand and process what had happened. But they were resilient, these children. They were flourishing in an environment where their medical needs were taken seriously, where their questions were answered honestly, and where they were surrounded by adults who prioritized their safety over maintaining comfortable lives. The book Sarah and I were writing was progressing well. Invisible Threats, Living with Hidden Disabilities in a Skeptical World would be published next year by a major medical publisher, with proceeds going to support groups for people with misunderstood medical conditions. Jessica's story would be included, but only as one example among many of how medical gaslighting can escalate to dangerous levels. We weren't writing an exposé or a revenge fantasy. We were creating a resource to help people recognize and address the kind of systematic doubt that had nearly killed me. As I set the table for dinner, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. A year ago, I'd been a grandmother whose family thought she was dramatic about her medical condition. Now, I was a survivor, an advocate, and proof that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Sarah, holding a bottle of wine and an advance copy of our book. "I thought you might like to see how it turned out," she said with a smile. I held the book in my hands, looking at our names on the cover, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Jessica had planned to write a book calling me a fraud. Instead, her actions had resulted in a book that would help thousands of people in similar situations. "Sarah, do you think Jessica will ever understand what she did?" Sarah considered the question for a moment. "I don't know. Sociopaths often lack the ability to truly comprehend the harm they cause others. But I know that her victims will continue to heal and help others, and that's what matters." That evening, as I tucked Lucas and Emma into bed, Lucas asked me a question that had clearly been bothering him. "Grandma, why did Mommy try to hurt you?" I'd been preparing for this question for months, and I'd discussed with Dr. Martinez how to answer it honestly without traumatizing him further. Sometimes adults get ideas stuck in their heads, and those ideas make them do things that hurt people they should love. Your mommy got the idea that Grandma's allergy wasn't real, and she couldn't let go of that idea even when doctors and tests proved it was real. But why couldn't she just say she was wrong? Some people find it so hard to admit they're wrong that they'll hurt people rather than admit they made a mistake. That's silly. It's more than silly. Sweetheart, it's dangerous. That's why Mommy can't live with us anymore. Grandma? Yes? I'm glad you're okay. Me too, baby. Me too. As I turned off the lights and headed downstairs to join David and Sarah, I realized that Jessica's greatest failure wasn't trying to murder me. It was underestimating my ability to survive, to fight back, and to turn her cruelty into something that would help others. She'd spent 20 years trying to prove I was weak and dishonest. Instead, she'd proven that I was stronger than she ever imagined and more committed to the truth than she could comprehend. And now, while she spent her remaining years in a prison cell, I was spending mine surrounded by family who believed me, helping other families avoid the trauma she'd inflicted, and living proof that justice sometimes comes in forms you never could have planned. The woman who thought my life was worth less than her need to be right was going to spend the rest of her life discovering just how wrong she really was. And me? I was going to spend the rest of mine making sure no other family ever had to go through what we'd endured. It was, I thought, as I rejoined my family in the living room, a pretty perfect ending to an imperfect story. Justice served, family protected, and truth triumphant. Jessica had gambled everything on being right about my allergy. She'd lost spectacularly, and I couldn't be happier about it.